Hello, this is the UCLA Housing Voice Podcast. I'm Shane Phillips. A quick note on the UCLA Lake Arrowhead Symposium that I mentioned at the top of last episode. As I'm recording this, we've only got 2 more tickets available through the website, so by the time you hear this, we are probably sold out. We're really looking forward to convening this event, especially with its focus on housing this year, and for those of you who are going, we will see you next month. This week on the podcast, we are joined by Professor Ingrid Gould of NYU, and we're talking about recent research by her and her colleagues on the impacts of New York City's Universal Access to Counsel program, a city effort to guarantee legal representation to poor tenants in the city who face eviction. In most cities, most landlords have lawyers to represent them in eviction court, and most tenants do not. The disparity is really striking, and right to counsel is intended to level the playing field, at least somewhat, and to hopefully reduce both evictions and eviction filings. New York City was the first big US city to implement a right to counsel program, and fortunately for us, they rolled out the program in a way that made it fairly easy to research and determine its impacts. We'll be talking about what Ingrid and her colleagues found, and some of the other programs and support that might be needed to get the most out of universal access to counsel. The Housing Voice podcast is a production of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, and we receive production support from Claudia Bustamante, Olivia Arena, and Jason Suteja. Feedback or show ideas can go to me at shanephillips@ucla.edu, and you can give the show a 5-star rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Now let's talk to Professor Gould. Ingrid Gould is Professor of Urban Policy and Planning with the NYU Wagner Graduate School of Public Service and Faculty Director of the NYU Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy. And we're excited to have her here talking with us about a recent article in Housing Policy Debate. That article is co-authored by Kathy O'Regan, Sophia House, and Ryan Brunner, and it is titled, "Do Lawyers Matter? Early Evidence on Eviction Patterns After the Rollout of Universal Access to Counsel in New York City." Do lawyers matter is a question we have all wondered at one time or another, or many times, and so we are looking forward to getting some answers here. Ingrid, welcome to the Housing Voice podcast.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
And we have Mike Lenz as our co-host. He is back from sabbatical. He is in Los Angeles. He is so fresh and ready to go. Welcome back, Mike.
Thank you, Shane. I'm extremely fresh. I am extremely happy to be, doing this podcast today. In particular, Ingrid has as much to do with the fact that I am able to sit around and have these kinds of fun discussions as anybody, and also the fact that I'm somebody coming back from a very beautiful, wonderful sabbatical as a comfortable academic. I owe a lot to Ingrid, and of course one of our prior guests, Kathy O'Regan, who's also a co-author on this paper, as the greatest mentors that anybody could have. So this is a big pleasure today.
Well, pleasure to have you as a student, Mike. So
for life.
As always, we start out by asking our guests for a tour. You are not our first guest from New York. Kathy O'Regan is one. We've had a few others as well. Mike is very familiar with New York. So let us know if you've got any good off the beaten path sites or experiences you'd like to recommend to people, or if there's somewhere, outside of New York City you want to share with us.
Yeah. Well, such a good question. And I feel like this is a challenge. I'm not sure I'm going to go that far off the beaten path, though. But we just had our annual Furman Center retreat at Governor's Island. And I had actually never been there. And it's really fantastic. It's like a 170-acre island, less than a kilometer away from Manhattan. So it's a very, very quick boat trip, ferry trip to get over there. It was originally used as a fort to protect the New York Harbor after the Revolutionary War, and it was later as sort of an army and a Coast Guard residential base. And now it's basically a year-round park with overnight glamping sites and parkland and concerts, urban farming, art exhibits, events, and actually some potential housing, which is something else. But so I would say that. I would say again, not such a hidden gem, but Prospect Park, I will say before 9 a.m., if you love dogs, it's just a giant dog party. So dogs can go off leash. So that's a great place. And then now this is all park. So the main reading room at the New York Public Library is just the most beautiful public space I think I've ever been in. It's just gorgeous, and the librarians are amazing, I have to say, too. And then I feel like I should say a museum, the Tenement Museum. So that's sort of fitting for us, which is an incredible museum on the Lower East Side that basically it's housed in two restored tenement buildings. And it basically, you can go in and see sort of recreated rooms that show you the living conditions of immigrants sort of in the late 19th and early 20th century. So definitely recommend all of those.
Yeah, I love those recommendations. They're specific, and you got a housing one in there. Got to have one.
Yeah, you really met quite a challenge there, right? I mean, everybody knows something about New York. Just one London connection there that came to mind is thinking about the fact that dogs being off leash is like a treat or something different, like you go to the park in London and there are no leashes and everybody has a dog and they're just running around being pretty well behaved. And you wonder
I was going to say they're probably better behaved than the dogs in this country, right?
What happened to American
the dogs
dogs
in New York? So,
okay, so to kick this off, this is about universal access to counsel, or right to counsel, as it is sometimes known. That's kind of the phrase that I was familiar with. It's a program that guarantees legal representation to people facing eviction with the hope that it would reduce the number of people being evicted. Why do advocates, just to get us started here, why do advocates believe that this is an important channel for reducing evictions? What's happening in places that don't provide universal access to counsel that these kinds of programs are trying to address? What are they trying to solve here?
Yeah, well, I mean, the big issue that they're trying to solve is basically tenants are just not represented in housing court in places where there isn't right to counsel. So just to give you an example, in New York City, as recently as 2013, just 1% of tenants in housing court were represented by a lawyer as compared to, over 90% of landlords. And so a big part of the push is to sort of to redress that imbalance and why is that important? I mean, I don't know whether you've spent time in housing court, but housing court it's a complicated place, right? It's a confusing place. There's poor signage. There are lots of different courtrooms. You're not sure. Like, there's stories of tenants spending all day in housing court, but they never understood that they were supposed to sign in. And so they were there all day, but then they get a default judgment against them for not having showed up. So I think, the hope and the strong belief on the part of advocates of access to counsel that lawyers will help tenants navigate that process, that sort of Byzantine process, will help them challenge different procedural problems, raise counterclaims, and ultimately, more successfully represent the tenant in negotiations with landlords and landlord attorneys.
Yeah, it does seem like it's just, I mean, all aspects of law seem just very esoteric, and like if you haven't studied it yourself to try to work your way through that. And I think something you bring up in your paper as well is that housing courts are just so overburdened. And so judges aren't going to give you the time to kind of figure it out on your own. No. If you're not fully prepared and you don't know exactly what you're doing, a single mistake and you're probably, your case is out of there.
Yeah, that's right. The volume is high.
Okay, so before we get into the details of the New York Right to Counsel or Universal Access to Counsel program and your research into its effects, could you tell us about some of the previous research on the effectiveness of eviction counsel? I gather that earlier research had limitations regarding selection bias, among other things, which made it hard to extrapolate the findings to a broader population or to know that universal access to counsel would be as effective as more targeted legal representation interventions, for example.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly our earlier studies of the benefits of legal representation, and most of the studies are sort of observational, and they find that tenants with representation, with legal representation, generally get better outcomes in court. But the problem is that the tenants who are more likely to win their cases may also be more likely to secure legal representation. So you can't infer from those studies that the representation itself actually caused the better outcome, rather than tenants who are likely to have better outcomes are more likely to be represented. So now there were a handful of previous studies that did rely on sort of randomly assigned legal representation, but the issue with those studies, they were very well done, to be clear. It's just that they drew on some very small sample sizes, and also samples that were, as you said, that sort of were selected, and that they were limited to cases where attorneys believed they could win their cases, right? And so, and that was true for both the treatment and the control cases, but they basically excluded any cases where the lawyers were less confident. And so it's not clear that those results of those studies are generalizable to a broader provision of access to counsel, which is sort of what happened in New York. Also, let me say one more thing on this, which is that when we first started doing this study, I spoke to a bunch of lawyers, and they were like, well, why are you doing that study? Like, of course lawyers matter. And in fact, another story is my co-authors, two of whom were lawyers, did not like the title of the paper, that Do Lawyers Matter?
It's a given, of course.
But yeah, exactly. So I think it's important to emphasize that it's actually not obvious to me anyway, that access to counsel will necessarily reduce eviction. So lawyers can't find rental relief, right, if those programs and resources don't exist for their tenants, right? They have little ability to change the long-run affordability of apartments and the many challenges that tenants face in the labor market and in their personal lives that make it difficult for them to pay the rent. And so it's just, it's not immediately clear that lawyers are going to fully solve this problem. And so we thought, anyway, so all that being said, we thought this was a topic worthy of studying.
Yeah, and most people facing eviction or having an eviction filed against them have it filed because they're in arrears, they're behind on their rent. Is that not correct? In which
That's
case,
right. Exactly. The overwhelming
giving someone a lawyer does not
cases
mean they have money to pay that back rent. It just means they have representation to fight the case. But
that's right.
At the end of the day, you do eventually have to pay the rent.
Yeah. So the question is this sort of prolonging the inevitable?
Yeah.
I mean, you have the same question as sort of foreclosure prevention programs if you're not writing down the debt. So I think it's like I said, lawyers, and well, I'll answer when we talk about the results, whether lawyers matter.
Yeah. So let's talk about the New York City program. There is a lot to cover here, but I think the key questions are, what services does it offer? Who is eligible for those services? And how was the program rolled out sequentially in such a way that putting this all together, it let you study the impacts of right to counsel in a more, I guess, convincing way, or in a way that you could maybe extrapolate a little further than previous research. So basically, how was this program structured, and how did that make it more amenable to research than previous studies?
So the Mayor de Blasio signed the Universal Access to Counsel bill into law in the summer of 2017, which made New York the first city in the country to offer sort of broad legal representation to low-income tenants in housing court. Other cities, I have to say, have since followed, right, including a lot of large cities, Philadelphia, Newark, San Francisco, Denver, Baltimore, Minneapolis. But at the time, it was the first city. The law basically commits the city to providing free legal assistance to qualified tenants. I mean, every tenant in housing court now can get are entitled to sort of a brief legal consultation, but tenants that earn less than 200% of the poverty line are entitled to full legal representation, which includes legal advice, preparation and filing of court documents, negotiation with landlords and their attorneys, and representation in hearings and trials and appeals. And critically, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about this later, tenants must respond to an eviction filing in order and appear in court in order to actually receive representation. And so not all eligible tenants who receive an eviction filing are actually receive representation. So the take up is less than 100%. But the idea is that when tenants do respond to an eviction filing, when they show up in court, then they are supposed to be connected to providers who screen them for eligibility and then are assigned a lawyer. So I think do you want me to talk about the rollout too?
Yeah, and let's talk about how it was structured as sort of cohorts and how it began in just a few zip codes based on, as I understand it, these were places that had higher rates of shelter entry for people who were homeless at the time. Tell us about that, but it strikes me as sort of almost designed to be easily researched and to study its impacts. But also, I'm sure it was just a matter of resources as well and not being able to roll this out citywide all at once.
Yeah, it was a matter of, it was rolled out gradually because of capacity, right? So you could imagine that if you suddenly said in Los Angeles that every single tenant in housing court is guaranteed a lawyer, well, there might not be as many, enough lawyers in housing court to
where did the lawyers and
to
judges
represent
come from?
everybody. Yeah, and so so the city couldn't just suddenly announce that everyone would have access, and so what they did was they rolled it out gradually by zip code, and where they would sort of add a certain number of zip codes every year, and then the idea was by 2022 the program would be citywide, but it gave sort of a ramp up period. And the city, as you said, the city sort of chose those initial zip codes basically on using the criteria of number of shelter entrants and also number of evictions. And so, while the program was rolled out that way for capacity reasons, you're absolutely right that it ended up being sort of serving as sort of useful in developing an evaluation design, because we can exploit that gradual rollout, and by basically comparing changes in outcomes for eviction outcomes for tenants coming from zip codes where the universal access to counsel was rolled out early to changes in outcomes for tenants coming from similarly disadvantaged zip codes where universal access to counsel wouldn't be rolled out until somewhat later. And there ended up being, every year there's sort of a new cohort. So we could look at that. And that can really help us isolate the effect of legal representation, specifically over and above all the other things that the city was doing during this time to try to prevent evictions.
Yeah, there's definitely some similarities to Los Angeles, at least from what I recall. I, of course, about a year ago, ran away from Los Angeles housing problems, kicking and screaming, and didn't really look back very often to see what new horrors awaited our city. But as I recall, there was a pilot being formed at some juncture to provide universal access to counsel. But again, I think based on geography, some of that was also based on council districts, because there were particular council persons that were spearheading that effort. So I don't think they rolled it out in as comprehensive a manner or in a manner that is kind of as well suited to study as the New York case. And, I just want to add also, in this paper, I really found it quite impressive the way that you and your co-authors really explained not only the program rollout, but also the housing and legal context of New York, kind of the history behind how we got to this place in eviction and housing court provision. So really a model, I think, for how you situate a study and not just kind of describe who the cohorts are and that sort of thing in kind of a basic social science way, but also we know New York is a little different than probably where you are, but here's what the context is. And then it kind of, I think, makes it a lot easier for people to connect what this study does to their setting.
Well, I appreciate that. I highly recommend having lawyers as co-authors, so
right.
who help with that institutional knowledge. and which can be really important, that institutional detail.
So lawyers do matter.
Lawyers do matter. Exactly.
Lawyers matter for social science at a minimum.
The other thing, I just want to underscore something that you said, Mike, though, because I think, yes, the program was rolled out slowly because of capacity reasons, but you're right that it didn't necessarily have to be rolled out in such a systematic way. So I think in many cases, demonstration programs start this way. And it really would be fantastic if local governments, state governments, federal government could really think about even, nonprofit providers think about sort of when capacity is naturally limited, thinking about rolling those programs out in ways that make it easier to evaluate. And so you have a good comparison group.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the results. You were interested in whether the program resulted in more tenants receiving legal representation in their eviction proceedings, which would be a good sign that it's reaching its intended audience. But ultimately, this is about stopping evictions. And if it increased legal representation but didn't reduce evictions, that'd be, a lot of money spent and maybe not a whole lot to show for it. So what did you actually find on both of those metrics of representation and, a change in executed evictions?
Yeah, so the first question that we examined was take up. And as noted, right, just because you offer legal assistance, it doesn't mean that people will take it up, right? And that's true of any kind of social programs, right? Just because you offer it doesn't mean that people are going to take it up, right? Access can be complicated. In the case of legal representation, tenants actually, again, have to actually respond to the eviction notices and show up in court in order to be represented. And the majority of tenants, at least in New York City, don't do that, don't show up.
And I do think maybe it sounds like, why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you get, this free representation? But I'm sure there's partly just education, people not being aware that this is an option, but also people feeling like, well, maybe there's some selection bias going on here too, where people are like, well, I know I'm 3 months behind on rent. Like, what's a lawyer going to do about that? And so this idea that many people are not taking it up, I think it's not that surprising, even though it might sound that way.
That's right. But I think, again, maybe we can talk about it a little bit more, that there may be sort of, I think that's one of the things we should be thinking about as more and more cities kind of seem to be adopting access to counsel programs, to think about implementing them in ways that it encourages take up and encourages, and even if they don't, I mean, just what can we do to encourage tenants to come to court?
Right.
So we did find that the program increased legal representation, and we found that by 2019, nearly 30% of tenants with eviction cases were represented in the zip codes where the universal access to counsel was rolled out early on, up from less than 5%. So it went from less than 5% to about 30%, less than 5% in 2015, to like 30% in 2019. And representation increased citywide at that point too, but only from about 5% to about 10%. So the increase was significantly larger. So, while the program didn't reach everybody, and it also reached some people who weren't in the targeted zip codes, it clearly succeeded in providing increased legal representation. And I should say also the second, you mentioned two outcomes, but we also looked at the share of tenants coming to court to actually respond to eviction filings. And we found that that went up too, from like 20% to a little above 40%, but it actually turned out it went up citywide. Which is kind of interesting. It didn't actually go up much more in the zip codes where UAC was rolled out. And, perhaps because sort of publicity about the, and I'm sorry, I'm saying UAC, I mean Universal Access to Counsel. That's the acronym that's often used, that publicity about the availability of legal representations, spilled out to other zip codes. And then, but ultimately what we really, the key question is whether increased representation led to better outcomes in housing court and reduce the percentage of filings that result in an actual evictions. And there, we were somewhat hampered in that we, in our time frame, we could, it just takes a while for cases to make their way through court. And then the COVID pandemic hit, New York City, New York State sort of radically expanded, basically strengthened the rent regulation laws. And so we really can only look at the early cohorts and look at sort of 9-month impact. But we did find that even in that very short term time period that we saw that the warrant execution rate, or the share of eviction filings that resulted in an actual eviction, fell significantly more in the zip codes where universal access to counsel was rolled out, and it was the relative decline was about 1.6 percentage points, which sounds small, but on the other hand, only like 8 to 10% of eviction filings in New York actually result in executed eviction. So it's not insignificant.
And that happened at the same time as executed evictions. The rate of executed evictions was going up in non-UAC zip codes.
That's right. And that's right. It's so the relative difference was this 1.6 percentage points. I mean, we basically, to just sort of benchmark the decline, we came up with the back of the envelope estimate that if you assumed that decline citywide and you assumed sort of the level of the volume of eviction filings that occurred in 2019, that you would see 2,000 fewer evictions citywide in each year. So, that's not insignificant.
I'm sorry, I forget. Did you look at the impact on eviction filings as well in the UAC versus non-UAC zip codes? And I ask that just because it seems like maybe this would take some time to really settle in, but you could imagine how if landlords know that tenants are going to have legal representation, or at least the right to it, that they might file fewer evictions, especially kind of more frivolous or dubious ones.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We did look at that. We didn't ultimately put it in the paper. We saw some, sort of suggestive evidence of a relative decline in filings, but we thought that theoretically that probably would take a while for landlords to sort of learn about the program, see how it was actually going to play out. And so we didn't have great theoretical reasons for thinking that, at least in the short run, that you would see kind of a behavioral response right away on filings. And so we decided to leave that out of the paper and focus on the outcomes for which we thought we would see a more direct impact.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just know that I've heard that as an argument, and it does make logical sense.
Yeah, no, it does make sense.
There are certainly landlords who file frivolous claims, or because they know that most tenants are not going to fight back, and maybe they're not even expecting to have to execute the warrant or go through the courts. Maybe just filing the eviction notice will be enough for some to leave. And you could imagine how, again, if they have legal representation, that might be a little scarier of a thing to do on the part of the landlord.
Yeah, over the longer run, I mean, I think that's absolutely true.
We've done a few episodes now that talk about evictions, most recently with Eva Rosen and Philip Garbodin. And the running theme in all of them is that the eviction process is very messy, and the data on evictions are often incomplete, or they're hard to track down. And as we kind of talked about already, every city, every county seems to have its own process for all of this and its own rules. This study, as Mike said, was designed really well, but there are always limitations. So what were they in this case?
Yeah. So there are definitely limitations. I think we have pretty good data, but there are definitely limitations. And I'd say that, let me frame this in terms of, like, if we really wanted to answer the question of whether this program is a good investment, you want to do kind of a full cost benefit analysis. And so, what on the benefit side, it's important to emphasize that we're really only looking at one outcome, which is executed evictions, right? But lawyers could help tenants in other ways, right? They could reduce the amount of debt that they have to pay back. They could negotiate, rent abatements for poor housing conditions. So there's sort of other benefits that lawyers could provide. And similarly, you need to think about the cost side. How much do all these lawyers cost? And and in the end, on both the cost and the benefit side, again, we really only can look at sort of what we are able to look at in this paper is sort of very short run impact. So we may not be able to see sort of, longer term benefits, whether those are smaller or larger. I think it's also important to study whether over the longer term, whether universal access to counsel might actually discourage landlords from providing rental housing altogether. I mean, critics of universal access to counsel basically argue that tenant representation is simply going to prolong the eviction process. It's going to ultimately that making eviction more costly means providing rental housing more expensive, and so therefore you could imagine fewer rental units and higher rents. And so these kinds of universal access to counsel could theoretically increase rents across the board, which I think to really answer, to do a full program evaluation, you would want to do that. And then finally, of course, there's the issue of generalizability. I mean, you both sort of mentioned this, right? This is New York City, right? This is a city that probably has a more tenant-friendly housing court than a lot of cities across the country. And, I'm not sure which way that goes, which way that cuts. I mean, it could mean that lawyers make less difference because actually tenants do pretty well in housing court anyway,
Yeah.
Or it could mean that lawyers make more difference because there are more rights to protect. Right. So in places where the tenants have no rights, then what claims does a lawyer have to assert?
And it's just a matter of knowing how to make the correct claim, which a tenant is very unlikely to be able to do without some kind of representation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, one thing that you brought up there, Ingrid, I think is really interesting, in that essentially this issue of cost to the landlord and, how that affects rents, or there's a lot of people who think that landlords matter too, right? And they're not, anybody who's been a renter tends not to think too fondly of landlords. And, generally people who, I think landlords are often, pretty unpopular in housing discussions, but there's a lot of people that I'm sure are rightfully concerned about the increased cost to landlords if there's always an expectation that everybody has to have a lawyer. I think in Los Angeles, usually something like 90% of unlawful detainer cases, the landlord is represented. So they're already usually coming with lawyers, at least in LA, but these costs are incurred to the landlord, whether or not the tenant shows up. They still have to, they're still going to have a lawyer. They're going to pay for that. And then if the other side, the tenant side has a lawyer, which, I think is leveling the playing field, of course, like it may result in, more trials or more longer disputes that require more and more costs. And, again, if you don't care that much about landlords, I understand that, but somebody has to kind of pay for that in some sort of way. And that may end up being a future tenant of a landlord who knows that they need to have representation every time they go to court.
Yeah. I'm not even sure. I mean, I don't even know that you have to necessarily, for the listeners out there that don't care about landlords, I still think you should care about this issue, right? Because again, and actually Boaz Abramson, who's he just got his PhD from Stanford in economics, and he's now an assistant professor at Columbia Business School. And he has written a really important working paper. He basically develops a model of eviction, and he focuses on San Diego, where there was a sort of a pilot legal representation program that and resulted in that represented tenants were in court for longer and they had to pay back less of their rental arrears. And he found that right to counsel policy increases landlord costs so much and rents across the board rents so much that it ultimately resulted in more rental defaults and higher rates of homelessness. And I think we need more research on this, but I think the paper provides a really important cautionary note about sort of the risks of access to counsel and policies that make evictions much more costly. And I should say the other thing that he doesn't focus on so much, you also have to worry about what landlords are going to do at the front end, right? If they can't evict people at the back end. So what kind of additional screening and selection criteria are landlords going to use? And so could this reduce access to housing for rental applicants who appear to be risky to landlords. Could this, and in that way, could this kind of facilitate some discrimination? So I think all of these things are things that down the road we really need to study more fully to understand the full effects.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And what you just brought up about the screening, that was really a focus of our conversation with Eva and Philip in particular. So your analysis ends with data from 2019, but we're now 3 years later. Has there been any follow-up, even, informally, to see if the impacts have held up over time or maybe even strengthened as more landlords and tenants have familiarized themselves with the program? I do imagine that COVID and the eviction moratorium kind of threw a wrench in any plans you might have had for a follow-up study, if that was your intention.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, with the COVID pandemic and the moratorium on evictions, it's been it's such an unusual period that I'm not sure we can learn that much from it. I will say that, apparently tenant representation, legal representation among tenants has gone way up over time. I mean, it's now a majority of tenants in housing court in New York are now represented. Again, this is an unusual time. There are an unusual set of tenants that are in housing court, but still, that's important. I will say that Mike Cassidy and Janet Curry have written a really terrific sort of follow-up working paper that, and they look at a somewhat broader, they look at a somewhat longer time period than we do, but they're sort of stymied by COVID. But they look at a somewhat broader set of outcomes, and they show that tenants, not only are they less likely represented tenants are not only less likely to be evicted, but they also face smaller monetary damages in housing court. And that was something we didn't look at. So and they also observe significant heterogeneity across zip codes and find that lawyers seem to have greater impacts in poorer places and poorer zip codes and those with larger shares of non-citizens, which I think is important and suggests maybe some targeting as cities across the country, other cities think about providing free legal assistance, that maybe they should think about targeting it if they don't feel that they have the resources to serve everybody or feel like they're concerned about what the costs would be in terms of the rental housing stock altogether.
Has there been any thinking or proposals about targeting? Because, I think about this in terms of, like, what's a good analogy? Here in Los Angeles, I think there have been some efforts to, using big data or other means, try to proactively identify people who are at risk of homelessness. And it sounds like a great idea. If we can figure it out, that would be wonderful. It's apparently very, very difficult. But you can understand why they would want to do that, because if the answer is, well, we're just going to give money to anyone who might be at risk, that's going to be very costly. And we know that most people who at any given moment are at risk of homelessness do not become homeless, in the near term. And so in that sense, the money is sort of, I don't know if I would say wasted, but might have been put to better use. And it seems like the same could be said here, where maybe more targeted assistance to people we're more sure that really need the help or will benefit from it could go a lot further if we don't have unlimited money to spend, which presumably none of us do.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Everything you said, I agree with, right? It's just, yes, theoretically, we would want to target this assistance to the people who are most likely to benefit from it. I think that's difficult to do, right? Mm-hmm. It's difficult to identify those tenants. There's a lot of unobserved factors that you really can't see in terms of who has, family that they can rely on and turn to. And there's, I think that most of the programs that I know about are limited to low income tenants. So that's been really the targeting that's been done. I think that there's now something of some advocates are calling for a broadening of representation to make the program truly universal. But, I think, again, if you believe the Janet Curry and the Mike Cassidy results, I'm not sure that necessarily would be wise right now, that maybe we should, focus more on the lower income tenants who really can use the assistance more.
Mm-hmm. I didn't ask how much this program has been costing thus far. And also, if you could tell us a little bit about the other programs and services that were rolled out around the same time, because I think it maybe helps explain part of why representation also increased outside of the UAC zip codes, and maybe is, something of a confounding variable here where, not all of the impacts that you've seen are necessarily the result of the UAC, but maybe other things that are going on in New York around the same time.
So the cost estimates are about, a little over sort of $3,000 per represented tenant, I think, is the most recent estimates I've seen.
That sounds like a lot to me.
Yeah, I don't know whether that sounds like a lot or a little. If you compare that against what, you think that sort of the work of Rob Collins and Davin Reed, Winnie Van Dyke and others showing, some really significant social costs of eviction that you could argue actually that's not so large.
Well, I guess it's not so much that it's a ton of money per tenant. I guess it's like, I'm thinking about how much rent are tenants behind when they go to eviction court. And is it more than $3,000 on average? I don't know the answer to that, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was less. Yeah.
In New York and LA,
it's only
probably.
But in most places,
yeah.
Yeah, no, but it's not insignificant, right? I think that in terms of your other, and clearly the key is like we need to balance any benefits that we find against those costs and the full, like I said, any costs in terms of on the rental market as a whole. I think that in terms of other things that were going on in New York, there was a big push on there was some adoption of some anti-tenant harassment policies in the city. There had been some earlier versions of an earlier increase in resources to represent tenants across the city, and there also was in the middle of 2019, I think I mentioned this, a significant strengthening of the rent regulation law in New York City, which made it more difficult to evict tenants, and also arguably reduce the incentive that landlords had to evict tenants because they no longer could get a charge more rent to sort of the next tenant that came in. There was the vacancy bonus was eliminated.
Right.
So there were a lot of things going on.
I wanted to highlight one other thing, and this is my last query of any kind, I think, and that's kind of the geography of housing courts. In LA, we've changed this quite a lot in the last, I think, decade, a couple times. We first shrunk the number of housing courts we had kind of just around the county. And it's a huge county, obviously. We went down to 5 eviction court hubs at one point, and then we expanded to 11. And a now graduated doctoral student, Kyle Nelson at UCLA, found kind of an interesting thing that this is like a trade-off in a way between kind of physical access to a court and procedural justice, because when you increase the number of courts, it makes it harder for the nonprofit legal community to kind of serve everybody in a small number of locations, right? Because they can't have offices everywhere. And I don't know, whether, so that to me, I think is another policy mechanism in which you kind of shape how people are going to access the court, whether they're going to show up, whether they're going to be supported by a lawyer. And I just don't, recall exactly what that looks like in New York.
Yeah, it's a really good question. They're basically in New York, there is there's one housing court house per borough or per county.
Yeah, that's what I pictured.
Yeah. Plus there these sort of community courts as well, but most housing court cases have to go through the main housing courts in their borough, and that those. New York is different than LA in that there's better public transportation, but it still can be that some people live very far away from those housing courts, and there's actually one really nice study that looks at default rates in Philadelphia. And that's, again, the default rates are the cases where tenants don't show up and respond to an eviction filing. And they find that tenants are more likely to default or less likely to show up in court when their travel time to the courthouse on public transit is longer, right? And so that's pretty pretty significant. And you're right, there could be some trade-offs though, that if we suddenly, whatever, double or triple the number of courts, you might have to worry about what kind of challenge that means for legal service providers to get to those courts, but also you might worry about inconsistency in treatment across those courts, right? But potentially, so that could be also. So I think it's a really interesting policy question, but I do think we need to think hard about access to these courts and make sure that tenants can get to the courts, that they're given multiple options of dates where they can come to the courts, and right. it's something definitely to think about as you design these programs.
So it sounds like we're pretty certain that for the purposes of writing a research paper about eviction, lawyers matter. Definitely they matter. Seemingly they even matter for reducing evictions by providing legal representation. From what you've learned about this so far, studying this over the years, where would you like to see the program go in the coming years?
Yeah, so like I said, I mean, I think that I would like to learn more about who are the tenants who are not showing up in court, mm-hmm. and why are they not showing up in court, and how can we make it easier for them and communicate to them that they can get help if they show up in court, that they're not going to get help if they don't show up in court. So I think that's something to think hard about. I think this question about targeting is important, and think about whether there are ways for us to target. I mean, right now, New York, because of staffing shortages and sort of now the increase in evictions after the moratorium, there are really staffing challenges, and people even eligible tenants in housing court aren't getting access to lawyers mm-hmm. immediately. So I certainly wouldn't expand the program right now. I think we do need to learn more about it. And then I would say also, I think it's important that, yes, the answer is that lawyers matter, but I think it's also important to contextualize to say that lawyers can't do everything, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They can't make tenants show up in court. They can't address the financial crises and other crises that lead tenants to housing court. They can't find resources for tenants that don't exist. They can't, ultimately they can't address the structural problems in the housing market that, and most notably the lack of supply, which, Mike has studied a lot, that make housing so expensive and put so many families at risk in the first place, or prevent them from even getting into their own homes. And so I think it's important to put this study in that context.
Yeah, I said I was not going to say anything else there, but that really makes me think of, another piece of this, or another way to kind of think about the no-show issue with tenants, not showing up to court. I think it's important to impress that, and I'm borrowing again from Kyle Nelson's work, in which he basically discusses and frames that a lot of tenants that are facing an eviction have, some kind of what he calls housing trouble that they've been experiencing their whole lives, maybe, and probably their whole adult lives, or maybe the last 5 years, 10 years, whatever. Like, housing trouble is a daily fact, weekly fact, monthly fact for them. And so, if I can speak for myself, who has not had anything like housing trouble for at least my post-college years, probably, or maybe post-graduate school years. It's hard for people like me to, I think, put yourself in their shoes, right? Where housing trouble is an everyday thing. They get this notice from their landlord, or they get some threat, or they get this eviction notice. And to some of us, that would be like this cataclysmic day, right? Just like you've never thought about you wouldn't think about anything else. Like, how am I going to deal with this? I need to go to court, whatever. People in this situation often have been dealing with so much around this landlord, around this unit, around this neighborhood, whatever, that it's just more noise. And so I'd say that to certainly echo and second, this idea that we really need to study more about that, and how there's this bigger context of housing trouble that we need a bunch of other things in place to solve. But there's this smaller issue of representation that we also don't really know a lot about. We have some theories, but we don't do a great job of studying people who don't show up, right? That's just kind of, part of social science.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. And I will say sort of on sort of what else do we need? I mean, I think that having a standing emergency rental assistance program that would be near the top of my list. I think we have really good research that shows that those kind of short-term emergency resources can really make a difference in stabilizing families and helping them avoid eviction and ultimately homelessness. And I think there must be complementarity, right? In terms of sort of how much of a difference can lawyers make if when they represent tenants, they can connect them to these emergency resources. So I think that would be high on my list.
Yeah, we still need to know if lawyers matter more than other things, X, Y, and Z, different interventions we could be doing. Well, Ingrid Gould Ellen, thank you so much for joining the Housing Voice podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
You can read more about Ingrid's research on our website, lewis.ucla.edu, and you can find show notes and a transcript of the interview there too. The UCLA Lewis Center is on Facebook and Twitter. I'm on Twitter at Shane D. Phillips, and Mike is there at MC_lens. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time.